One moment.
Okay. Great. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today for our Halloran-hosted town hall. My name's Paula Murphy and I'm our Chief Client Officer, Managing Director here at Halloran. I'm happy to be joining here to introduce today's topic is total data control and custody, moving from Excel to complete integration for better clinical trial decisions. So for today's panel, we're so excited to be diving into a case study that's prepared by the Global Data Strategy and Innovation team at CSL Behring and joined by our experts here at Halloran. CSL has recently designed a data infrastructure for their studies that has allowed their teams to have better control over their data, leading to more informed decisions. They have great lessons learned and a lot of context behind their change and are going to be sharing their insights with the panel today. Now, before we get started, I do have some housekeeping items. So please put yourself on mute during the panel sort of presentation. There's going to be some things, but we do want active participation. So if you want to get to a point, ask questions or as part of the discussion too, please press *6 if you called in to unmute yourself, or just press unmute. And we do encourage folks too to be using the chat, through the Zoom here with any questions as we're going along. We're going to be monitoring the chat and we'll be answering the questions, as we go. We really want this to be interactive. So, in terms of those folks, as you're going to be joining us here for the first time, some people are new here. I just want to introduce sort of Halloran. We are a life sciences consulting firm that really specializes across the areas of development, specifically within regulatory quality and clinical. We provide a lot of that deep domain expertise, but also provide a lot of the development strategy and the organizational solutions and technology enablement services to advance these functions really to the next level of growth and change. We host these town halls really with an effort to bring our network together, to openly share our collective knowledge and all of our experiences that we deal with on a day-to-day basis with some of those more pressing issues and challenges. We want to learn from each other to advance the industry forward. It's really important to us. And so in that spirit, I think it's really important that we now get into the panel. So Megan Powers is our moderator today. Megan is the director of the Clinical Practice Operations Group here at Halloran. Megan has over 20 years of experience in clinical, specifically in the clinical operations space, as well as in the development and execution of clinical programs. So we really want to thank Megan for you moderating today's panel. I'm going to hand it over to you now to introduce our panelists to get this going. Megan?
All right, thanks so much, Paula. Good morning, everyone. We are so happy to have you here. I am absolutely thrilled to be partnering with CSL Behring today, and they have a particular case study to share with all of you, and then we'll have a larger discussion around building data integration systems, key considerations throughout the entire process, and then we'll think through the future of clinical operations. So we're going to be covering a lot today, and I'll be sharing notes and key takeaways from today's discussion. Before we kick it off, I'd really like to start with introductions. Paula did a better job of introducing myself than I could have done, so you all know me. Let's kick it over to Charles, followed up by Tony and Karen.
Thanks, Megan. I'm Charles Johnson. I'm the Director of eClinical Operations here at CSL. I've been in the industry now for going on 25 years, and I've been doing eClinical in some way, shape, or form for the last 15. I've been now with CSL for 5 years, so I'm well placed to talk a bit about the data journey that we've taken, especially over the last 5 or 6 years here at CSL. So, Tony.
Thanks, Charles. Hi, everybody. Tony Ciliberto, Senior Director, Global Clinical Operations. I fall within that 25-year range as well. I've been at CSL, it's approaching my 6-year anniversary. Primarily always been in the operations area of clinical research.
And Karen.
Hi, I'm Karen Travers. I'm a consultant here at Halloran with a focus really on technology and leveraging data to help companies make better decisions. I've been in the industry 25 years with varying positions, but all around technology and data. Back to
Wonderful,
you,
thanks
Megan.
all. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, so to gauge where our attendees are, we're going to put up 2 brief poll questions. Maria, we're ready for you. Perfect. Maria, just let me know when we have the majority, and then I'll move on.
We'll just give it just 30 more seconds.
Yeah, of course.
Sharing results now, Megan.
Perfect. So it sounds like the majority sit in, or 2/3 sit in clinical operations, and 76% of folks consider the difference between data you own versus data you don't. So thanks so much for helping us get started there, Maria. All right, so for those at CSL Behring, I'd love for you to share your data journey story with all of us and what incited you to bring this topic forward. Perfect. Thanks, Maria.
Thanks, Megan. So I think the big thing for us was we were a heavily outsourced company that used a lot of disparate systems, kind of across all of our portfolio for capturing data. And in addition to that, as we kind of started out small and started to grow, we were in a situation where we were using a lot of outsourced partners. And a lot of those outsourced partners kind of held our data for us. We didn't have much control over it. So our ability to really take a look at what we had as far as data quality, data integrity, we were really hampered from really having any real internal insight into that data, in a lot of cases until it was a little bit too late. And then we had to do the mad scramble around database locks and things like that. And the preparation of SDTM and ADAM got pushed back as a result. TLFs got pushed back as a result. So we really wanted to start getting control of the way that we managed our data. So to talk about that a little bit, if you go to the next slide, I can talk about where we were. So prior to 2015, we really were in this situation, like I mentioned, where everything was kind of spread out and disparate. And we really started to realize that we needed to pull things together a bit. Our data management team lacked some leadership. We didn't really have a clear end-to-end view of clinical data, even operational data. So anything around trial logistics, we were struggling there as well. We had our own internal CTMS, but we weren't heavily using it. We had a lot of reliance on external service providers to do that for us. I won't drain this slide, but data standards were definitely a problem for us. We identified it as a problem back in 2010. We tried to really do something about it, tried to really implement some level of a data standard, but we never really stuck to it. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that we were so heavily outsourced. So taking that one standard and trying to have 4 or 5 or 6 different CROs follow it exactly the same had become very difficult for us. Just kind of managing it, from study design to study design. And we didn't really have an aligned approach internally around what we wanted to do around data review, whether that be leveraging data management dashboards for review of data, or data management's interaction with medical and safety around reconciliations or medical review of data. And we were relatively disconnected from biostatistics because they used a preferred provider as an external service provider for their biostatistical analysis. So there was a lot of disconnect when they were using kind of their own external service provider, and we were using another as far as the data capture and data cleaning. Next slide, please. So on the top here, this is kind of an illustration of where we were, kind of in the current state in 2016. We had a very large scale study, 20,000 patient study that was about to come through development. And when we started to look at things, we noticed that we're very flat. So data comes into our vendor's EDC, and then we got Excel spreadsheet outputs where we're printing large stacks of paper for data review. And it was very difficult for us to kind of continue to monitor our data quality. And we started to devise a plan around where we wanted to be. So taking all of our disparate systems down the left and attempting to kind of centralize that data and allow us to have some higher level visualization around that data so that we could address data quality issues, data integrity issues, and hold some of our sites and CROs accountable for the data quality that we were getting. Again, we wrapped that around this large scale trial. And on the next slide, Tony will talk a bit about the structure of that study team and the need for us to really try to gain some control over the way that we were capturing data. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Charles. So primarily being in operations, I have to admit, I really was not on board at first. I didn't really see the strategy. I like many operations, they just want to go. You just want to get things moving, and you sort of, you'll figure out the reporting, the data piece as you go. Especially when Charles and his team would sort of flash up slides like the one you previously saw. It really didn't speak so well to the ops team. But when, as Charles alluded to, with CSL in the prepping stage of about to embark on this incredibly large mega trial, over 18,000 patients. And then, for us, the biggest trial we had done to date was 1,200. And so a lot of what Charles spoke to, we could get through, we could make it work, but we were starting to really feel the pains of the challenges that he outlined previously. So when we laid things out and we looked at all of the different partners, we'd have a global CRO. Cardiovascular really wasn't an area CSL had much credibility or relationships in. And so when we planned out that we'd need to be going to close to 50 countries, close to 1,000 sites, we really needed to lean on some academic partnerships, networks. And so when we laid it out and we looked at all of the different partners and the different high buckets of scope that they would be performing in, that's a lot of places for your data to sort of reside. And so for any sort of naysayers or those that were really on the fence and needed further convincing within CSL, when we would share a layout like this to me is what really helped convince us that this was the strategy we absolutely needed to do if we were going to have the level of oversight and ownership that we would want on our data on this trial that was going to take somewhere between 5 and 6 years.
Thanks for that, Tony. Next slide, please. So what we learned from that study is when we started to pull that data together, it put us in a position where we had to kind of pull everyone together and everyone's voice had to be heard. And what we created on the other side of that was an ecosystem that really allowed for us to build complex data flows and give us the ability to really have data at our fingertips at any time. So we took the strategy that we used in that AEGIS-II study, and we started to think about how we could apply it more broadly to the rest of our portfolio. And when we did that, we came up with kind of 4 pillars that we knew we needed to meet. The first was around our data ownership, because we had realized prior to that AEGIS-II study we really didn't do a very good job of internalizing our data. And we really needed to get that data internalized to maintain some level of ownership over it. The second thing is around interconnectability. Like, we really were not integrating with systems much. We were not connecting our source systems. We had duplication of entry across the enterprise. And when you have duplication of entry like that, you really struggle around understanding where your sources of data are. And it also makes it very difficult for a senior level, senior management reporting as well, because you don't really know where to pull the data from that gives you the true story of where the study actually is. We also weren't centralizing data well enough for us to provide higher level insights for, not just senior leadership, but also from an oversight perspective. How are our sites doing? What's the health of the study? We weren't doing a very good job around those things either. And we really started to see with that Aegis 2 study that once we centralized all that data and once we commanded the ownership of that data, we really had those insights at our fingertips. And then the last thing is around standardization. Standardization allows us to get from data input to our submission ready data sets. So if we look to build some level of standardization, even if there's some customization from study to study, a lot of the work that we needed to do around SDTM and ADAM allowed for us to, having some standardization allowed us to kind of get to those things a little bit easier. Next slide, please. So we created a project around data flow. So after we realized we had these 4 pillars, we created a project around how do we identify, really what we want to do around our data flow. So again, all of our disparate systems and all of our different types of data down the left-hand side here, a centralized data warehouse that we developed to gather that information. And then on the right-hand side, you see some of the outputs that we have for some of that data. I want to touch a little bit on what we've done in the middle here around our clinical data warehouse, because it's not just a data repository, it's not just an archive space. A lot of what we're doing here is also managing our data standard. So as part of our data warehouse, we have a metadata repository that allows us to build out each one of those data standards. Now, we've done this for standard kind of data collection like medical history, demographics, and things like that. But we've also started to build some therapeutic area specific standards as well around cardiovascular, around what we're doing with gene therapy. And we've really started to hone in on really standardizing our data collection. With that standard, we're not just kind of building the forms and fields, we're also building all of the ADAM and SDTM data set structure behind it as well. So we collect a piece of data, a day later, you can see what a SDTM data set looks like. There's also a repository function. So, definitely a data archive function, but one of the more interesting areas of our clinical data warehouse is our SCE environment, where we do a lot of our high level programming. So not just programming those SDTM and ADAM data sets, but we also do things like Java embedded reporting capabilities that we are able to illustrate out into our Spotfire capability that gives us some additional drill down and capability within our visualizations. In addition to that, we can write programs around data transformations that we may need to support things like risk-based monitoring, where you see our accelerate output there, that's our RBQM system. In addition to that, you can see that we're able to allow our partners into this area as well. So the partners that we use, they're able to transfer their data into us and pick data up from us as they need it. ParXL, who's providing our data, our biostatistics support that I had mentioned previously, now operated within our environment instead of operating within their own environment. So we always had a connection to what they were doing for us from a TLF perspective, and we could always see what was going on there and what these CSR outputs were going to look like. So this kind of allowed us to kind of standardize our data flow across CSL from a study perspective, and centralized our data in a way where we could claim some ownership. Next slide, please. I believe this is my last slide, but this is the future. So this is where we have gotten to. We've continued to kind of build off of that data flow project. You can see that the sources of our data are very well defined now, and there's even more of them than what you're seeing here. This is a cut down version so that it can fit on a slide. But our data sources have grown very large as we've continued to kind of interact with some of our external service providers. As the types of data have grown that we've started to collect, places where we were getting data in from. So one of the things, for instance, that's missing is our capability now of ingesting wearable data as well. And pulling those in through that CDW, that data hub. And then you can see here both, we've now separated our storage capability into both clinical and operational data. One of the things that we started to realize is that operational data started becoming very, very critical for senior leadership. So we needed a way to be able to aggregate that data separate from the clinical data, because it gives additional insights into the health of the clinical trial. So we started to maintain those two big pieces of data separately, but have because they come from a common central data hub, we're able to dashboard and report on them together as needed. But we did start to realize that there was a need to start maintaining storage areas for both clinical and operational data separately. It just gave us more flexibility in what we were able to produce as visualizations. That's all I have to present. That's the CSL data journey to date. And I'd love to hear any questions.
Yeah, so I have some follow-up questions because I'm the moderator and that's my job.
Yeah, sure.
But there was also a question that came up in the chat while you were going through your slides, and thanks for the question, Todd. When you mentioned historical data quality issues, were those quality issues with operational data or patient data? Asking for a friend.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really both. I think from a clinical data perspective, because we had a delay in our ability to kind of see the data, we were running into issues when we would come into like interim database locks or database locks around data quality. We were putting a lot of trust around data quality and data cleaning into our external service providers. And then if you're a data manager, you know how it is. Once you get that data in, what it looks like in EDC doesn't always tell the full story of what's going on when you've kind of had the ability to analyze that data altogether. So we did end up in a situation where we had definite clinical, clinical data, clinical data quality issues. But I think too, we had a synchronization issue on the operational data side. So again, I had mentioned that we had our own internal CTMS system. So we had a lot of situations where our internal study teams were putting data into our own CTMS as they saw the study progressing, but we weren't seeing some of that mirrored in what the data that was being collected from our ESPs, specifically around milestone data, which is very difficult to maintain. The things around monitoring visits and things like that, we had to trust some of that, and it wasn't that there was maybe cleanliness issues, but we didn't have the level of oversight that we would have liked to have had, over what was being kind of recorded in a monitoring visit, or what we would have liked to seen in a monitoring visit. So we started doing some things around, once we got that monitoring data in from our ESP, for instance, we would then fill out a monitoring oversight report within our own CTMS so that we could record the fact that we've taken a look at that data and that it's either satisfactory or we'd like to see these improvements here or there, things like that. So there are some things that we started to be able to do once we started to internalize that data to kind of perform better oversight on what we were seeing from our ESPs. Tony, I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add there. I know that you and your team.
I think you highlighted some great points, but to your point exactly, we were very reactionary. We weren't really proactive in a way that we could, with confidence, give the level of oversight that we wanted, that our study teams wanted to do and our senior leaders expected us to do. I mean, in fact, RCTMS sort of became an afterthought. So it would be populated if the teams would get around to it because they were so dependent on Excel exports or other reports from our external providers. It really just put the team in a sort of uncomfortable position. They could never really feel empowered when they would report on a study or have to give a quick ad hoc update. It was always probably, you know, most likely based on something they had received the previous week or a few days ago. And so it just, when your teams don't feel empowered, when they don't have the confidence to really speak to the level of accuracy and data that their senior managers expect them to speak to, it does a lot to the overall morale.
Yeah, thank you both. That's incredibly helpful. You know, kind of moving away from the journey a little bit, or as an add-on actually. So for those attending today that haven't gone through a similar journey as the one you just outlined, where would you recommend that they would start? Like specifically, maybe like what does the planning process entail? How early is too early?
I mean, so I know from an operations standpoint and working with Charles for the last 5 years, there's no such thing as too early. I admit, you know, eClinical was sort of a new term for me when I joined CSL 6 or so years ago. And to be quite honest, I didn't really give them a whole lot of, you know, yeah, we'll update that group when I think the time comes. But it's really acknowledging that that team needs to be part of that core team strategy up front. And so whether you outsource, whether you FSP, whatever your overall strategy is, it's good to engage the clinical group up front, lay out who you think all the partners will be, where the data will reside, where it'll be coming from, what your plans are. Because if you don't think it's a big deal, you know, Charles and his team may see it as a big deal. And so there's never a too early time. What we generally say is when we start to put together operationally that study execution team for once an outline's approved and once you start going down that path, that's the time you start looping in our eClinical group, because they do want to know from the get-go what that design might look like and what the overall strategy may be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Tony. As you know, it's really never too early for us. Yeah. I think too, as we start to see more complex study designs as well, you know, we kind of start seeing some weird things in the design, or weird things in the way that, not necessarily weird, but different things than what we're used to seeing, as far as the way that the study teams may want to collect the data, or even where they're collecting the data now. The idea around what a study site is starting to change a little bit, as well as, you know, too. So we have to start getting a little bit creative about how we're going to get that data in. So the earlier we can find some of those things out, the better. And I think too, one of the things that you do eventually get to is really a standardized approach on how you make those connections. So there's some things where we don't have to spend a whole lot of time talking about it, but if there's a new modality that's being introduced, like there's a new wearable that you want to use, or I'm going to collect data from a dialysis center now instead of collecting it from a normalized site, for instance, those things start to build in some complexity that we have to plan a little bit differently for.
Yeah, absolutely. That completely makes sense. A couple questions that have come up in the chat. So let's get through those before we move on. So Jonathan asked to the group, can you speak to the validation performed for data sources to hubs to storage, including duration? Was it built and validated from the beginning, or as systems were ready to come online? Which data hub is then used for the study final data used by stats?
Yeah, so there's two answers to that question. So for the very specific study that we initially set this up for, we validated as we went along. So as we connected new systems, we went through a full-scale validation. Now, what it took, because we were coming from a situation where we had never done this before, to a point where we were trying to institute something new. We had dedicated resource from both IT and QA to support us in those validation efforts. So when we initially got this done, we had a whole lot of interaction with IT and QA, and the validation kind of went, I would say, about a year as we kind of validated new systems and brought them on board. When we made the switch to look beyond that initial study in 2016, we did it kind of on a step-by-step basis. So as we instituted the new clinical data warehouse, we validated the clinical data warehouse, then we validated the environments that were going to be used by external service providers. And then as we started to make each connection into that clinical data warehouse, we validated each one of those connections. We had, in the beginning, I would say our validation runs took anywhere from 6 to 8 months. We're probably down more to like 6 to 8 weeks now.
Great. And one more question, and then we'll move on. How are you handling your safety and pharmacovigilance data? How are you integrating safety data across studies?
So right now we're leveraging RSG, so the Rave Safety Gateway. So as SAEs get entered into EDC, we have a automatic transition into our safety database. We also have reconciliation platforms that we did set up in that Spotfire solution. So that data gets pulled on a daily basis, and reconciliation protocols within a dashboard are updated on a normalized basis so that we can see, kind of as queries are being answered by safety and what we have in the database kind of start to mesh with one another. So that's the major way that we're doing it right now. We are taking a closer look at the way EDC and safety interact with one another currently. Not because the situation that we're currently using is problematic. It's we want to make a move towards having safety a bit more involved in the clinical database. So our safety group right now, our pharmacovigilance group, for instance, does not go in today and enter their own queries. They're really only doing it for one mega trial, the one mega trial that we have. But we've seen a lot of success with them doing that. So we're definitely looking to change that model to get them more active in the clinical database. Because what we've seen within other projects is that data management is not querying it as efficiently from a safety perspective. And when they do get response from the site, they always have to go back and confirm it with safety anyway. So to make that process a bit more efficient, we're starting to take closer looks at what we're doing there.
All right, great. And I actually missed one at the top. So maybe this is the last one, then we'll move on. Paul says, thank you for sharing. What products/vendors did you use in the creation of your CDW? Did you use off-the-shelf products, or was there much customization given the 4 months from user requirements to go live?
So it's a very good question. When we look at technology vendors, we typically try to go with someone who's either best in class or someone who is the right size fit for CSL. So for the CDW, there are a lot of solutions out there, SAS being one of the bigger ones. But we really went with someone who we felt we could continue to increase our capability to develop as they increase theirs, which would give us a lot more input into the direction of the product. So we did form a partnership with Sycamore Solutions, and we've been using that system for our CDW.
Great, thanks so much. And so someone asked a question about large studies. It was Dan Larson from Elevate Bio, and so I'm going to actually skip down to a question about size. And I think that Dan's question will get answered in your response to this question. So I'm sure, I know that there are attendees here joining us that aren't running large trials. So what are your thoughts around the value of this type of data system for smaller studies? And I think the bigger question and the fascinating question is it needed? And Karen, I'd love to hear your insight on this too.
Do you want me to start? Or?
Sure.
Yeah. I think it is probably not to the same extent, but I think you can put practices in place and start with some of those standards and start with some of the real, I think as Charles referred to early, or really owning your data and making sure you control what it looks like and that you have the right access to it and you can manage it. I think if you start doing those things on the smaller scale study, you won't have the big huge effort to try to get ready to do a bigger study. You're going to be ready kind of all along. And then I think even more importantly, you're going to be able to answer those operational questions, with ease and with confidence, which is a big challenge right now. So I think you probably don't have to start at the scale that CSL did for a 13,000 patient study, but I think it's incredibly valuable to do the basic steps so that you would be ready to. I don't know if you guys have anything else to add there.
No, I totally agree with what you said, Karen. I do think that centralizing your data in some way, I do feel is the most important part. Do you need to go to the level of integration that we've done with sources and things like that? I don't necessarily think that that's completely necessary if you're only running smaller studies. But I do think that there's a lot to be said about centralizing your data. I think having that ownership of your data and being able to do your own signal detection around data quality is very, very important. And I think additionally, as the industry starts to move more towards like clinical data science and things like that, you're going to have some decisions to make around whether or not you want to outsource, the additional capability that you get around your data from having that level of insight into your data. I think having the ability to use things like AI and machine learning around the data that you capture as well to kind of help predict what the next protocol or project needs to look like. I think if you're going to start getting into doing some of those things, and that's some of the direction that we're realizing that we're able to go now that we have this ownership of our data. We can really start to gain some insights out of the data that we've previously collected on clinical trials to help define what the next one needs to look like. And I don't know, but I feel like that's something that shouldn't be farmed out. Like we should be making those insights on our own.
Right. So what if you don't have the infrastructure to house a data warehouse?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, being able to use those modalities is not specific to the way that you decide to house the data. I still think that there are things that you can do to kind of glean some of those insights, from actually having that data at hand. I do feel that having some level of a data warehouse, regardless of the size of the studies that you're running, is an important thing. It gives you other advantages. It gives you other advantages around the data that aren't so predictive or forward thinking or anything like that. I just think it kind of gives you a little bit of security around repository of data, having the ability to glean your own insights from your data, being able to respond to litigation requests or things like that around your data, and having the ability to arrange that data appropriately to respond to those questions. It kind of gives you some additional flexibility that you really just can't get from having your data in a spreadsheet or in a long listing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure there's a lot of people on this call right now that, given all of this information, they start to think about executive buy-in, right? So how do I get the C-suite to buy into this? And so I would ask, what was your experience on this? And
Yeah,
Karen, if you could provide any industry, blinded client examples, that would be really helpful to flavor this.
Okay. I'll let you start, Charles. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the big thing for me was convincing Tony first. That's the big thing. I think the folks that you're gonna, for lack of a better term, be in the foxhole with, trying to deliver these things, you have to win those hearts and minds first, I think. And then coming together as a unified study team cross-functionally to senior leadership and kind of letting them know, like, if we don't start doing some of these things, it's going to hinder our ability to be able to deliver on time with quality. I think that that's the real important piece. But I do think that executive buy-in is critical, because some of these things are not inexpensive to do, and you're going to need that senior leadership support and buy-in to really move the needle and push things forward.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I operationally, I said it before, but I'll say it again. It's important to me that my teams are able to speak with confidence, with empowerment, with really the ability to message and deliver a message that this is where we are. This is where the trial is moving. Not that we're waiting for the report from a CRO, or we'll be able to get that to you next week when we get the updated report. It really sort of, in my mind, starts to muddy the water, starts to paint a picture that I don't want my teams to be painting. And again, I wasn't aware of this strategy of this philosophy until I ran into Charles and Tom, 6 years ago. It did take quite a bit of talking to and selling internally, but we just felt with the investment the company was about to do, we knew the level of question, scrutiny, review, overview, what was going to come hot and heavy at us. And so we were able to not just highlight how this helps the sort of e-clinical strategy at CSL for now and beyond, but also from a GCO standpoint, that it really will empower the teams to navigate, speak, stay ahead of the curve, be proactive in their planning, switch their strategies in ways that we would believe to be novel. It really is not always something that's a given, depending on where you may be in terms of a sponsor or a CRO.
And I
Karen,
think,
anything to add here?
yeah, I completely agree with everything. And I think, we talked a few minutes ago about, starting some stuff when you're a little smaller, right? There's I think some small things you can do that don't require probably the huge investment you had to make for a 13,000 patient study, that you can do kind of along the way, just in terms of standards, in terms of, taking ownership, getting some stuff put together, that I think will make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And I think the other big thing is the quality of decisions, right? You don't want to have to be looking at a study and say, either we're fine on enrollment and really find out a month later you needed to add a bunch of sites or something was off just because you didn't have control over that data. And there's more examples than I could ever cite of things like that happening, right? Just because your data is a week old, a month old. So I think incorporating this from the earlier stages of your studies, when you can do some small things and then kind of build up on that investment. So
yeah, I mean, Karen, I want to just highlight, because I don't want people to get sort of lost in the message that, well, we'll do that if we ever do a trial of 18.
Yeah.
And I mean, and we know that those don't come around a lot. For us, for the leadership that was in place at the time, it was always sort of kicking a can down the street until it went from, we don't need it, until all of a sudden, oh, we need it. And it would have been nice to have started to maybe do it on our 1,200 patient trial. That would have given us a lot of lessons learned to what we ended up doing on the larger trial. But I have to say, what we did and what we learned from that and where we are now is completely night and day. It's just that we sort of took our lumps on something that was incredibly large for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So questions come in. Is there guidance or process documents that your team has put together to set standards?
Definitely. And I do think the most important thing around standards is the governance, is having a cross-functional governance. So we do have, we call it a change control committee. So after we established our initial standard, we put a committee in place that allowed for, whenever there were changes that needed to be made to the standards, it had to be discussed cross-functionally before the standard would officially change. And we did put guidance in around, that governance structure, the escalation process in the event that the individual is not happy with the decision that comes out of that committee. There is an escalation capability for them. So I do think that putting like some level of structure around the way that you're not just capturing your standard, but also governing that standard beyond is very important.
So
I think
what would you say are the absolute essential roles for that team structure? Karen, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask another question. Can I do that or just bring up something to support Charles' point?
Yeah, sure.
Now I'm going to say I completely agree with standard and governance. It's something I preach probably more than people want to hear. But I think one of the things we talked about the smaller companies, right? That doesn't have to be a gargantuan effort to start, right? You can start with a small number of standards. You can start with a really small governance committee. So it doesn't have to be an overbearing thing, I think. I think people hear governance and they get like, oh no, we don't want that.
And that effort that we did around standards in 2010, I think that's exactly what happened. They tried to boil the ocean and then it just kind of falls flat. So what we did is we really just decided this is our standard today. We're going to draw a line in the sand, and there's going to be people that disagree with that. So let's give them a mechanism to voice those concerns, and then we'll start making some changes and updates. So that was the way that we approached it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Did I cut you off, Tony? I thought I did. I'm sorry.
No,
Okay.
not at all.
No, I think this is great. And, we're talking about standards, we're talking about different sizes, and we're talking about the teams, right? So if we're talking smaller companies, smaller people, small manpower, and Todd just asked a question, which I think will kind of loop into this, as far as staffing a group to execute this, you need Tony's vision and support, someone like Charles, and then what's the priority, right? So is it a data engineer? Is it an analyst? Like, we're going to have a team here, but let's talk like what's essential, right? If you don't have the luxury of having a 50,000 person company.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a great point. You do need to identify a centralized role who's kind of the master of ceremonies essentially, or the keeper of the standard, really. And within CSL right now, it's our clinical programming group, because they're the ones who are the keeper essentially of our CDW, which houses our MDR. So they are kind of the neutral party to settle arguments between Tony and the data management staff and our clinical research folks around, or maybe even someone from safety around the changing of a standard. I do think that it's important to have a representative from safety. It's important to have a representative from clinical operations. I think there are some companies out there that are small enough where clinical development and clinical operations are in the same, kind of like in the same group. But if it is separate, I do see sometimes operations getting kind of closed out of these conversations. But it's not just a conversation with the person who's responsible for developing the protocol, right? It has to be that operations person as well. They're going to bring the insight around how that standard is going to land with the site, and it becomes super important when you're discussing these things.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Tony.
I just agree. I mean, it's not massive layers of folks that it has to pass through. In fact, it's incredibly fast. It's at tops, 3 or 4 people. But as long as it covers the roles that Charles just outlined, that's all you need to make the decision and then move on.
And just real quick, so data, as far as a data engineer goes, and it's one of the things I had mentioned where, internally here at CSL, we are starting to look a little bit more towards, like, now that we've gotten to the point where we have these robust data flows, we're really starting to get to the point where we're trying to dig deeper into our data. I do think that that's where data engineering becomes more important. When you're starting to look at curating master data management across R&D, when you're trying to start looking a little bit deeper into like AI and machine learning modalities for your data. When you're starting to do those things, then having a true data engineer come in and start to look at your data flows and how that data could be used does become very, very important. But I do think that you have to start smaller, and then as you get to a point where you get more and more mature in your data collection and your data flow, then you start bringing in data engineers to try to kind of take you to the next level of where you're trying to get from an analytics perspective.
Yeah, totally fair. And I want to switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about team. We've talked a lot about standards. I think let's talk a little bit about, looking at the time here, and based on the questions that are asked, I want to hit these questions that are going to be most impactful for the group is, data custody. So who should really be owning the data, and what disconnect or misunderstandings have you seen while going through this process?
Yeah. So, Karen, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm guessing we're on the same line, so you go.
So I think as far as ownership goes, ultimately in the end, when we get audited, I'm on the hook. So therefore, I feel like I should own that data. If I have to be the one that has to answer for it, then we should own it. I think it's a very, very important, but I think a very straightforward concept. Now, I do feel as if our external service providers have a certain responsibility in the reporting of that data. But I do think if ultimately in the end I'm responsible for the oversight of the way that they capture that data, then I need to own it. That's just my personal feeling. I think what happens is when we leverage ESPs very heavily and we're kind of using their SOPs and things like that, I do think that starts to kind of muddy the water a little bit. They're collecting the data the way that they normally collect the data. They feel some level of ownership around it. I do think that we had to battle a little bit of that. Maybe not necessarily in that large scale study that we did with Tony. I think that was a very collaborative engagement that we had. I think more of the frustration was around how do we incorporate everyone's process in that particular case. But I do think that was a bit more collaborative. But I have seen in other areas where there's been a little bit of reluctance from our external service providers around allowing us, for instance, to connect directly to their CTMS and pull their CTMS data in. They do feel as if some of that information is a little bit of a guarded secret. So we have had to kind of push and pull a little bit on some of the data that gets captured there, specifically too around if the site that we're using has a relationship with that CRO. They do get a little bit guarded around like the monitoring data and things like that. So we have had to massage those things a little bit, depending on the service provider.
But it's all about the relationship. I mean, it does require to take some time to talk about what your strategy is, outline the details. Not everybody's used to seeing this. So initially their reaction is to sort of pull away or sort of look at you funny. But operationally, if we have the right types of talks with our trial partners or service providers, I have found that after a few conversations, everybody's aligned in understanding it better, and we're able to sort of move in the way that we'd like to.
Yeah.
I think also, Charles, and you kind of alluded to this, it's really setting up kind of the culture in your company that you own the data, even from the earliest stages. One of the things that I think I hear a lot that makes me always concerned is like, okay, the CRO's got that, they're taking care of that, they own that. I try to, the data is your ultimate product of the study, right? That's what you're telling the agency. And I think it should become very integral to the company that that is your product and you own that and you need to take control of it.
Absolutely.
Great.
And I think one thing to just throw out for small companies, in the beginning, even if you don't bring it all in-house and have the data warehouse, you should still take ownership in making sure it's set up how you want, you can access it how you want, and you can control it and be able to use it. So I'll stop there.
It's fantastic. Wow. You guys, we can go on and on and on. So I would say too, just to wrap up, I want to just thank Megan, Tony, Karen, and Charles for just this amazing panel discussion. And I feel like we didn't even get a chance to really open it too much with questions, but I really appreciate those that were brought in through the chat. I would say if anybody has any last sort of burning questions, please enter them now into the chat and we'll try and get through them offline and send you guys out some of the responses. We're going to pull together, we will be sharing the recording as well, and we're going to pull together some notes too for everyone. But really thank you all for just an amazing panel discussion. I do want to also invite you guys to, there's going to be a speaker series on April 27th on helping smaller companies with risk indicator best practices. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you again, really, thank you very much, Megan, Tony, Charles, and Karen. What a wonderful discussion.
Yep.
Great
Thanks for
panel.
having us. Thank
Thank
This
you
was
all.
great. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.